Well, welcome to the webinar, everyone. Thank you for joining us to hear the latest information regarding New York State's New York Forward plans and return to work for the clean energy industry. My name is Alicia Barton. I'm President and CEO of NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I'm joined by several of my colleagues from NYSERDA, as well as partners from sister agencies who I'll introduce in a moment. Whether your company participates in programs run by NYSERDA, by other state agencies, or the state's investor-owned utilities, we thank you for taking the time to view the webinar and learn about the state's plans for a safe return to work under the first phases of regional reopenings. We know this information is of utmost interest to your companies during these times, and that many of you are eager to get back to work as we are. But as we've heard from our governor on a daily basis, a reopening of our economy must continue to prioritize the health and safety of all New Yorkers. We hope that the information provided today will help you ensure that this is the case, and NYSERDA and our sister agencies are here to support that clear objective. Speaking of the other agencies and utilities, I want to give a special thanks to our colleagues at the New York Power Authority, Department of Public Service, Long Island Power Authority, and Department of Environmental Conservation, who have been working collectively to support the state's COVID-19 response under the leadership of Governor Cuomo, and have been planning and coordinating around the reopening effort. We have also been coordinating with the state's utilities, coordinated primarily by the Department of Public Service. At this point, I'm going to hand over the microphone to have my colleague, Chair John Rhodes, Chair of the New York State Public Service Commission, to provide some opening remarks. NYSERDA and DPS work in close partnership in normal times, and suffice it to say that that partnership has even increased in strength since the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis. We're grateful to have John here to provide some introductory remarks, and with that, I'll hand it over to you, John.
Thank you, Alicia, and welcome to all of you who are attending this webinar. And it's a pleasure to join you for it. This important, opportunity to convey some information. My team and I greatly appreciate the coordination and collaboration among the state's energy agencies during these trying times, and we've been proud to work alongside you in supporting the state's COVID-19 response efforts as led by Governor Cuomo. Our agencies are also profoundly grateful to our partners in the field, utility workers and clean energy workers and companies in New York State who've been doing their very best to navigate these very challenging times over the past 2 months and helping us to keep us safe and secure through essential business operations. This pandemic has been very difficult for all of us. It's claimed the lives of more than 20,000 of our fellow citizens and upended the livelihoods of millions more. And we know that the economic fallout has been crippling. Recently released job loss numbers for clean energy workers across the U.S. and in New York are staggering. Alicia and I, along with our fellow agency heads, are deeply concerned by the losses that have taken place. Our hearts go out to everybody in our industry who has lost their job or is facing economic hardship as a result of the crisis. Now, in mid-May, we can take some solace in the fact we are finally, as Governor Cuomo put it, on the other side of the mountain, with many critical health indicators pointing in the right direction. Those indicators are even favorable enough to begin the careful reopening of certain industries in certain regions of the state. This reopening process, New York Forward, is the core of what we will be discussing on this webinar. We know you're eager to reopen, and we are too. And in doing so, we must take a deliberate and thoughtful approach to ensure a safe and productive reopening of our economy, and one that minimizes the risks of a resurgence in virus transmission. We are counting on you as program contractors to approach the return to work with the highest standards of safety, full adherence to the guidelines and protocols from our state's health officials in order to ensure the safety of our clean energy workers and of New Yorkers across the state. We need you to take this seriously, and we thank you for doing so. Before I turn it back to Alicia, a final note of reassurance to say that despite these tumultuous times, our state remains fully committed to our critical and ambitious clean energy goals and to fighting climate change. We have to fight this pandemic. We have to ensure the state's economic recovery, and we have to deliver clean, good energy for New Yorkers. Thank you again for your partnership and for your attention. Back over to you, Alicia.
Thank you, John, for that perspective, which is very well said and a great foundation for the next set of information we're going to provide on this webinar. So here is the agenda for today's webinar session, which is fairly straightforward. We will cover the New York Forward regional reopening approach, discuss how the clean energy industry fits within the New York Forward framework, and then proceed to the major focus of the presentation, which will give a walkthrough of the New York State Department of Health's guidance documents for construction activities. I want to note now that there will be some important information towards the end of the webinar regarding requirements for attesting that your company understands this guidance, along with information on how NYSERDA's programs and other clean energy programs will be treating enforcement and compliance with these requirements. We are taking this very seriously, so please make sure to stay tuned in through the end of the webinar so that you understand those requirements. So to begin, where we find ourselves at this juncture is really a product of where we've come over the last few months. Next slide, please. All non-essential work stopped across our state following Governor Cuomo's executive order on March 20th and the statewide pause. As you know, that included the vast majority of all work being conducted under the purview of NYSERDA's and other clean energy programs across the state. Of course, as we have seen, this action had a direct impact on helping us control the spread of the virus, and we've now reached a point where we can slowly begin to reopen parts of our economy. Governor Cuomo has signed now 36 executive orders keeping the state's authority in line with the needs brought about by the crisis as it has evolved, and those executive orders and the state of emergency declaration are still in effect, and they continue to be updated. That being said, May 15th represented the end of the statewide pause order, and that has brought about a new stage in our crisis response. That is the phased reopening process that will take place on a regional basis within the state. As you can see here, this approach was laid out by the governor over the course of the past month or so, going back to late April, and will continue to evolve as facts on the ground change. As of the end of May, 9 out of the 10 regions have opened under phase 1, and 5 have moved to phase 2, as we will detail in later slides. However, this information is updated frequently, and recently it was indicated that 2 additional regions may be moving to phase 2 shortly. Next slide, please. As the slide indicates here, that phased reopening approach is now known as New York Forward. Next slide, please. Under New York Forward, as each of the state's 10 regions achieve the necessary metrics to begin their reopening, business activity restarts in phases. If it's unclear, this refers to the non-essential businesses and activities that had been paused, while the essential activities that have been open will remain so. The New York Forward guidelines will apply to both of those categories of essential and non-essential. As the governor has described in detail at his daily briefings, the eligibility for a region to begin reopening is determined by 7 key health metrics, including rates of hospitalization and fatalities, shares of regular and ICU hospital bed availability, and testing and tracing capacity. Our health and safety professionals have established these key metrics to ensure that regions are able to protect public health and maintain hospital capacity as they reopen, and to monitor facts on the ground in real time to ensure a safe reopening. Next slide, please. For those who may not be intimately familiar with the state's 10 regions and their respective counties, here is an overview. Feel free to pause the webinar on this slide to familiarize yourself if you need to. Under New York Forward, regional control rooms have been established and will be led by state and local officials to monitor the reopening of these regions. These control rooms will monitor the region's key health metrics during the reopening and will alert state officials if the region's metrics no longer meet the reopening guidelines and adjust the reopening plan for that region accordingly. Next slide, please. Once a region meets all 7 of the key metrics mentioned here, it won't immediately undergo a full reopening of business activity. Rather, it will advance to phase 1, which encompasses the industry sectors laid out in this slide: construction, agriculture, forestry, fishing and hunting, and retail limited to curbside or in-store pickup or drop-off, as well as manufacturing and wholesale trade. The box on the right-hand side of the slide shows you the subcategories within construction, which we expect will be especially relevant to your companies. Next slide, please. While of less direct relevance to the clean energy industry, shown here are the industries that are permitted to reopen under Phase 2 of the New York Forward Framework in regions making sufficient progress to achieve that designation. These industries include office-based work, retail, real estate activity, retail in-store, vehicle sales, leases and rentals, retail, rental, repair and cleaning, commercial building management, hair salons and barbershops. Again, as of the end of May, five of the regions, have progressed into Phase 2. Please refer to the link provided here for full details on the mandatory protocols for these industries should they be relevant for you, and make sure to closely monitor the progress of other regions approaching readiness for Phase 2 and beyond, as we expect that information will be updated frequently. Next slide, please. Here's a snapshot of what the regional monitoring dashboard looks like as of the end of May, which is available on the state's New York Forward website. As you can see, it displays each of the 10 regions and their progress towards the 7 key health metrics. Please note that this is a screenshot of the dashboard at the time this webinar was pre-recorded, so do not refer to or rely on any of the specific information shown here, which may have changed. But as an illustration, you can see that 9 of the 10 regions have met all 7 health metrics shown in green on the right-hand side, indicating that those regions have opened up under Phase 1. Under Executive Order 202.34, the full New York on pause order was extended through June 27th only for those regions not meeting Phase 1 reopening criteria, that is the New York City region. For the most up-to-date status on where a region stands with respect to reopening, please follow the link highlighted on the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. Given how frequently these metrics may change in the days and weeks ahead, including both progression and regression, you all have a critical responsibility to be monitoring the status of the regions in which you do business on a regular basis, ideally daily. Even after a region opens for Phase 1, it is possible that it could return to a pause status for non-essential work if any of the 7 health indicators dip below the required threshold. As you can see here, NYSERDA and other program administrators will not be emailing you directly to notify you of changes in regional status. It is your responsibility to stay on top of things and communicate to all your employees and subcontractors who need to know about where work is permissible and when. So you may want to bookmark the link to the state's regional monitoring dashboard, and even better, bookmark NYSERDA's COVID-19 response webpage, which will contain links to the regional dashboard and a host of other resources and information. Next slide, please. With that context for the New York Forward effort as a whole, let's now turn to overlaying our focus on the clean energy sector. Next slide, please. As previewed before, the primary way that clean energy activity fits into the Phase 1 work will be through the construction category. While there are some statewide exceptions that we'll cover in a moment, most clean energy construction work will fall under the main construction category and within the subcategories shown here. Some of the NYSERDA programs, including those related to workforce development and training, and potentially certain research and development work, may not fall within the construction category. We suggest that you use your best common sense and judgment about what is or is not construction, and get in touch with a contact on your program team to seek clarification in any true gray areas. And for those of you working under programs of NYPA, LIPA, or the other investor-owned utilities in New York State, you should contact your appropriate program contact to seek any clarification you might need. Next slide, please. So as mentioned previously, there are 3 categories of clean energy activity that are now permitted to resume on a statewide basis, irrespective of regional phase status. Those categories are reflected on the slide here: electric power generation and storage related development, construction, operation, or maintenance, except with respect to new solar project on a residential site, which must wait for phase 1 reopening. Electric vehicle charging station installation, operation, maintenance at commercial and government sites, and activity by a single worker who is the sole worker on a project site. As some of you are aware, this third category reflects an update to NYSERDA's prior guidance regarding construction that was conducted by a single worker who was the sole worker on a project site. NYSERDA has determined it is aligned with ESD's statewide exemption, allowing for a single worker who is the sole worker on a project site so long as the activity abides by the Department of Health construction guidance, as well as other applicable state, federal, local, or local laws and rules. Next slide, please. So for the vast majority of clean energy program work, whether qualifying for regional phase 1 as construction or qualifying for statewide resumption under the categories just highlighted, here is the critical requirement. All construction-related clean energy work or activity must adhere to the New York State Department of Health construction guidance. As part of this guidance, which we will walk through shortly, your company will have to develop and maintain an employer business safety plan, and you will be required to affirm via an online attestation through Department of Health that you have read and understand the obligation to operate in accordance with the Department of Health construction guidance. As stipulated under Governor Cuomo's Executive Order 202.31, this is a binding requirement for all construction work reopening across the state, and construction-related clean energy work is no different. Our energy agencies will expect and require this affirmation and full adherence to the Department of Health guidance as a condition for program participation. Importantly, in the case of NYSERDA, these requirements will be added to our program policies and program manuals and will also be reflected in other contractor notifications with program contractual enforcement. Other agencies or program administrators may have their own mechanisms for operationalizing the Department of Health requirements, but the requirement to abide by and attest to the Department of Health guidance will be applied across all clean energy programs involving construction work. And of course, in all events, contractors are expected to continue to comply with all relevant state, federal, and local rules. Next slide, please. So at this point, I will turn it over to Janet Joseph to begin walking us through the Department of Health construction guidance.
Thank you, Alicia, and thanks for tuning in, everyone. So what we see here is really the main source document that all our clean energy companies will need to read, to understand, and to adhere to as the phased reopening takes place, and that is the Department of Health construction guidance. So we will hit the key components of this guidance on the next few slides. On the left-hand side of this, you see the first page of the full 9-page guidance document, which we will link to in a moment. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see the first page of the checklist summary of this guidance, which will be a useful reference guide for you. On May 13th, the New York State Department of Health issued interim guidance for construction activities during the COVID-19 public health emergency, which can be found at the link provided here. So you can see this guidance is hot off the press. The purpose of this document is to provide owners and operators of construction projects and their employees and contractors with precautions to help protect against the spread of COVID-19 as our construction sites reopen. The Department of Health guidelines are a minimum requirement, and they are based on the best known public health practices at the time. The documentation upon which these guidelines are based can and does change frequently. Construction entities must adhere to these guidelines. They must adhere to all local, state, and federal requirements, and they are accountable for staying current with any updates to these requirements and to incorporate those updates to their construction activities in their site safety plan. In addition to meeting the minimum state standards, no construction activity can occur without also meeting applicable federal requirements, and these are outlined on the slide here. The state standards contained within the guidance apply to all construction activities, that is both essential and non-essential, in operation during the COVID-19 public health emergency until rescinded or amended by the state. Now, the guidance is organized into 3 categories: guidance for people, places, and processes, and we will walk through each of these in the next few slides. So starting first with people and physical distancing. Physical distancing requires that work which occurs indoors be limited to no more than 1 worker per 250 square feet unless personal protective measures are implemented, or unless a distance of at least 6 feet can be maintained among workers at all times. Anytime an employee may come within 6 feet of another person, acceptable face coverings must be worn. And you will see these themes throughout this guidance protocols of ensuring physical distancing and maintaining appropriate personal and protective equipment. Now, there are circumstances where a higher degree of protection may be required due to the nature of the work. And for those instances, the workers are required to adhere to the guidelines established by OSHA. Now, also to maintain physical distancing, workstations may need to be modified or restricted so that workers are 6 feet apart in all directions and are not sharing workstations without cleaning and disinfection between use. When distancing is not feasible between workstations, the use of face coverings or physical barriers must be provided, and the physical barriers need to be put in place in accordance with CDC guidelines. Regarding tightly confined spaces, such as elevators and vehicles, use of these spaces by more than 1 person at a time is prohibited unless all employees are wearing acceptable face coverings. Under no circumstances can occupancy in confined spaces exceed 50% of the maximum capacity, and measures should be taken to increase ventilation to the greatest extent possible. Workers also need to try to reduce bidirectional foot traffic through tapes and signs. So in narrow passageways, we want to encourage one-way flow instead of two-way flow. Moving on to the next slide, please. Signage must be posted throughout the work site. And the signage is there to remind employees to wear appropriate face covering when 6 feet distance cannot be maintained, to properly store and when necessary discard PPE, to adhere to physical distancing instructions, importantly to report symptoms or exposure to COVID-19 if they exist, and to follow hygiene and cleaning guidelines. In terms of personal gatherings, including job site meetings, these gatherings must be limited to the greatest extent possible in favor of other methods such as video or teleconference. When in a video or teleconference is not possible, meetings should be held in open and well-ventilated spaces, again, ensuring individuals can maintain that 6 feet of physical distance. Practices for adequate social distancing in confined spaces must be put in place with signage and systems to restrict occupancy. And schedules should be staggered for any gatherings, including meals and shifts, to observe social distancing. In terms of workplace activities, measures should be taken to reduce interpersonal contact and gatherings in the workplace. And these may include limiting in-person presence to necessary staff, adjusting workplace hours, reducing on-site workforce to accommodate social distancing, and shifting the design process, including using different teams and staggering arrivals. In terms of movement, to manage the movement of people and goods, the following measures should be taken. Non-essential visitors on the site should be prohibited. You need to designate areas for pickup and deliveries, again, limiting interpersonal contact. And on-site interaction and movement in general should be limited. Now we'd like to move on to the protocols and guidance regarding places. And I'd like to pass the microphone to David Sandbank, Vice President at NYSERDA, who will walk us through the balance of these slides.
Thank you very much, Janet. As you just heard, Janet took us through the people portion of the DOH guidelines. I'm going to take you through the places and processes portion. So starting with places and protective equipment, acceptable face coverings must be produced and provided to employees while at work at no cost to the employee. An adequate supply of face coverings, masks, and other PPE must be on hand in the event an employee needs a replacement or a visitor is in need. Face coverings must be cleaned or replaced after use and may not be shared. Please consult with CDC guidance for additional information on face coverings and other PPE. Employees must be allowed to use their own face coverings, but cannot be required to supply their own. Compliance with all the applicable OSHA requirements is required. Measures should be put in place to limit the sharing of objects such as tools, machinery, material, and vehicles, as well as the touching of shared surfaces. When in contact with shared objects or surfaces, workers must wear gloves and sanitize or wash their hands before and after the contact. Workers must be trained on how to correctly put on and take off, clean, and discard PPE. Adherence to hygiene and sanitation requirements as advised by the CDC and Department of Health is required, and cleaning logs must be maintained. Hand hygiene stations must be provided on site for hand washing and hand sanitizing. Appropriate cleaning and disinfection supplies for shared and frequently touched surfaces must be provided, and employees encouraged to use these supplies before and after use, followed by hand hygiene. Regular cleaning and disinfection of the worksite must be conducted with more frequent cleaning for high-risk areas and frequently touched surfaces. Cleaning and disinfection must occur at least after each shift, daily, or more frequently as needed. Please refer to the Department of Health's interim guidance for cleaning and disinfection of public and private facilities for COVID-19 for detailed instructions. Cleaning and disinfection of exposed areas must be provided for in the event of a positive case of COVID-19 of a worker, including all heavy transit areas and high-touch surfaces. Shared food and beverages must be prohibited, while bringing lunch from home should be encouraged. Adequate space for employees to observe social distancing while eating meals must be provided. If someone is suspected or confirmed to have COVID-19 infection on the worksite, follow the CDC guidelines for cleaning and disinfecting your facility, including close off areas used by the person who is sick, open doors and windows to the outside, and wait 24 hours before cleaning and disinfecting. Clean and disinfect all areas used by the sick person. Once the area has been disinfected, it can be open for use. If more than 7 days have passed since that person who had been sick on site, additional cleaning and disinfection is not necessary beyond routine procedures. Reopening activities are encouraged to be phased in to allow for operational issues to be resolved before work activities return to normal levels. For example, a limited number of employees and hours when first reopening should be considered to provide operations with ability to adjust to changes. Prior to returning to work, businesses must complete an affirmation on the record with Department of Health indicating that the state-issued industry guidelines have been reviewed, are understood, and will be implemented. A communication plan for employees, visitors, and customers should be developed, including the applicable instructions, training signage, and consistent means to provide employees with information. Okay, so now we've finished the people, the places, and now we're getting into the processes section. Mandatory daily health screenings must be implemented. Screenings may be performed remotely before the employee reports to work. Screening should be coordinated to prevent workers intermingling in close contact. At a minimum, screening should be required of all workers and visitors using a questionnaire that determines whether they have been in close proximate contact in the past 14 days with anyone who has tested positive for COVID-19 or had symptoms of COVID-19. Tested positive for COVID-19 in the past 14 days or experienced symptoms of COVID-19 in the past 14 days. According to the CDC, symptoms of coronavirus include fever, cough, shortness of breath, or at least two of the following in combination: fever, chills, repeated shaking with chills, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, or new loss of taste or smell. Employees must immediately disclose if and when their responses to screening questions change, such as if they begin to exhibit symptoms both during and outside of work hours. Daily temperature checks may also be conducted per Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or Department of Health guidelines. Keeping records of employee health data is prohibited. Personal performing screening activities, including temperature checks, must be appropriately protected from exposure to potentially infected workers and visitors and should be trained by individuals who are familiar with CDC, Department of Health, and OSHA protocols. Screeners should be provided with and use PPE, including, at a minimum, a face mask, and may include gloves, a gown, and a face shield. An employee who screens positive for COVID-19 symptoms should not be allowed to enter the work site and should be sent home with instructions to contact their health provider for an assessment. The local health department and Department of Health must immediately be notified about the suspected case. Information on healthcare and testing resources should be provided to the employee. An employee who has had close contact with a person who is confirmed or suspected for COVID-19 may not enter the worksite without abiding by precautions outlined in the following slides. All questionnaire responses must be reviewed on a daily basis, and a record of such review maintained, and contact must be provided to employees to report COVID-19 related symptoms that appear later. A site safety monitor must be designated whose responsibilities include continuous compliance with all aspects of the site safety plan. A log of every person who may have close contact with other individuals at the worksite must be maintained, including contact information, such that all contacts may be traced and notified in the event an employee is diagnosed with COVID-19. Cooperation with local health departments' contact tracing efforts is required. Employers and employees should take the following actions related to COVID-19 symptoms and contact. If an employee has COVID-19 symptoms and either test positive for COVID-19 or did not receive a test, the employee may only return to work after completing a 14-day self-quarantine. If an employee does not have COVID-19 symptoms, but tests positive for COVID-19, the employee may only return to work after completing the 14-day self-quarantine. If an employee has had close contact with a person with COVID-19 for a prolonged period of time and is symptomatic, the employee should not notify the the employee should notify their employer and follow the above protocol for a positive case. I'm going to repeat that last bullet. If an employee has had close contact with a person with COVID-19 for a prolonged period of time and is symptomatic, the employee should notify their employer and follow the above protocol for a positive case. Employers and employees should take the following actions related to COVID-19 symptoms and contact. If an employee has had close contact with a person with COVID-19 for a prolonged period of time and is not symptomatic, the employee should notify their employer and adhere to the following practices prior to and during their work shift, which should be documented. Regular monitoring, such as temperature checks, wear a mask, social distancing, and disinfect and clean workspaces. If an employee is symptomatic upon arrival at work or becomes sick during the day, the employee must be separated and sent home immediately, following the above protocol for a positive case. The local health department and Department of Health must be notified immediately upon being informed of any positive COVID-19 test result by a worker at the site. In the case of a worker or visitor testing positive, cooperation with local health department contact tracing is required, including notification of all workers and visitors who entered the site dating back to 48 hours before the worker became symptomatic or tested positive, but confidentiality must be maintained. Local health departments may implement monitoring and movement restrictions, including home isolation or quarantine. Employees who are alerted via tracing that they have been in close contact with a person with COVID-19 are required to self-report to their employer at the time of the alert and shall not be permitted to return to the work site. So now we're going to get into employer plans. So to pull this all together, your company's plans relative to the three categories we just talked through, people, places, and processes, you will be required to develop, maintain, and post an employer site safety plan. The state has provided a template to assist you in developing the business safety plan shown here on the right side. It is 7 pages long and will require you to fill in the information and answers to several critical questions, including the items shown on the bottom left of the slide here, plus more. Important note, these plans do not need to be submitted to a state agency for approval, but they must be retained on the premises of the business or construction site and must be made available to the New York State Department of Health or local health or safety authorities in the event of an inspection. This is going to be the last slide that I cover. As we stated before, the Department of Health construction guidance includes a mandatory attestation via online form. Each company will have to affirm that you have read and understood your obligation to operate in accordance with the guidance by completing and submitting the form linked here. And as a reminder, we've also re-included the link to the template for the safety plans. I am now going to pass the mic over to our General Counsel, Pete Costello. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And I first want to thank all the webinar viewers for continuing to this point and for your attention to these very important matters as we make our way through these challenging times. Before getting into the substance, I want to reiterate what others have stated earlier in this webinar. NYSERDA and other program administrators and agencies are going to be taking compliance and enforcement of these requirements very seriously. Contractors are expected and indeed required to follow all applicable state and local guidance with respect to New York Forward as a condition to undertaking NYSERDA and other clean energy program work. More specifically, the governor has issued Executive Order 202.31, which incorporates the New York Forward framework into law, including the requirement to adhere to the State Department of Health guidance on health and safety protocols discussed earlier in this webinar. Non-compliance with law will result in disciplinary action with several ramifications I want to touch upon. In the case of NYSERDA, our directive to comply with New York Forward law and guidance is deemed incorporated into all relevant program documents. And as such, noncompliance will result in remedies that may include actions such as the issuance of stop work directives or ineligibility to participate in programs. I also want to call your attention to the online complaint submission form included on the New York Forward website. The submissions of a complaint will result in investigation and, if credible, referral to local authorities for enforcement. In terms of complaint submission, individuals can file complaints regarding the operation of businesses or gatherings 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, through the online form or phone number shown on the website. And employees can file complaints against their employers directly with the Department of Labor through its online form. This information on complaints can be found at the link at the bottom of the slide. Lastly, it is my greatest hope that everyone will take health and safety seriously for the benefit of everyone so that enforcement can in fact be avoided. Therefore, I urge you to take every precaution to follow all New York Forward and other applicable federal, state, or local rules and guidelines. Now I will turn the presentation over to Courtney Moriarta, Director of NYSERDA's Single Family Residential Program.
Thanks, Pete. So just a few more slides here to do a little bit of wrap up, and we'll get to the finish line. As we round out today's discussion, we wanted to provide you with some references to a number of resources, fact sheets, and other materials that may prove helpful in formulating your company's plans for the safe reopening of work. Referenced here are materials from the key state entities leading the statewide return to work efforts, including New York Forward, Empire State Development, and the Department of Health. While the Department of Health guidelines provide a sound basis for returning to work, they are not exhaustive. To help companies locate additional information to fully operationalize their business safety plans, additional resources are shown here from federal and industry sources, including the CDC and OSHA, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, and the American Industrial Hygiene Association. These resources and others will also be available as links on NYSERDA's COVID-19 resources page. So we're just going to go through a couple of next steps and then we'll wrap it up. So thank you again for joining us today for this special pre-recorded webinar on New York Forward. Should you have any questions, please route them through the avenues shown here. In addition, please refer to our organization's COVID-specific web pages for timely information and resources. Going forward, please do stay on the lookout for updates, including new resources and trainings and targeted materials for specific industry groups, such as energy efficiency, solar, and others. We are all in this together, and we appreciate your attention and cooperation as we look to get back on our feet and reopen our businesses in a safe and thoughtful manner, always with the health and safety of New Yorkers as our core objective. As we continue our phased-in reopening, we anticipate that we will continue to work more intimately with many of you to work through your business operations and activities and to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much once again. We look forward to continuing to partner together to build New York back better and stronger. That starts with adhering to the appropriate health and safety measures outlined in this webinar. We thank you in advance for your commitment to following them. Be safe and be well.